Hello, it's Jayne Secker here with the Sky News Daily today. I've nipped out of the TV studio and into the small but perfectly formed podcast studio as Niall's a bit under the weather. Now, it's been the cornerstone of the UK government's immigration policy for 18 months, the plan to remove those seeking asylum here to Rwanda while their claim is processed.
Delighted and excited about our partnership with Rwanda to be a positive, secure, beautiful haven and home for many thousands of people.
That was Suella visiting Rwanda in March. Now the Supreme Court has put the brakes on that policy, saying it cannot happen.
Asking ourselves whether there were substantial grounds for believing that a real risk of refoulement existed, we have concluded that there were. The Home Secretary's appeal is therefore dismissed.
Of course, there's now a shiny new Home Secretary, but he's still singing from the same hymn sheet by the sounds of it.
Its judgment does not weaken our resolve to deter people from making these illegal, dangerous and unnecessary journeys.
So how did we get here? And what happens now? Let's find out. And also here, Sky News political editor Beth Rigby. So Beth, the government's lost this appeal to carry on with the Rwanda policy. I mean, make no bones about it. How crucial was this to the government's immigration policy? How great a blow is it that they've lost?
Jayne, I would say it's a huge blow for the Prime Minister and the government, and it's working on a number of different levels. I think kind of going into an election, the reason that this is a huge blow is that Rishi Sunak himself made getting the flights off the ground to Rwanda the totem, if you like, of his whole immigration policy and stopping small boats. So the symbolism of seeing failed asylum seekers getting taken on planes and relocating to Rwanda was meant to be the antidote, if you like, to the image of people coming over in small boats and landing on the south coast. So he made it the linchpin of the policy, and now this court ruling means it's highly unlikely that any of those planes will get off the ground before a general election. So yes, he can say to voters, we're stopping small boats. He will talk about the fact that crossings are down by a third. So there's lots of other policies around it. But this was, as I said, the symbol of the policy, and the symbol is failing.
Well, we'll come back to Beth later, but also with us on the podcast, immigration lawyer Nicolas Rollason, head of business immigration at Kingsley Napley. Nick, there's been a huge amount of legal back and forth from the moment this policy was first proposed back in April 2022 by Boris Johnson and Priti Patel. Can you just remind us how we got to this point?
Well, the policy was announced and then a number of decisions were made to remove 10 people from various countries, including Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Vietnam, amongst others. And they were given removal directions to be sent to Rwanda under the policy. And they obviously appealed against that. They went to the divisional court initially, who found that the policy which had been put in place was lawful. There was lots of criticisms of that decision because the court didn't consider a lot of the evidence around what was going on the ground in Rwanda. So the case went to the Court of Appeal in June, and by a majority, the Court of Appeal found that the risk of individuals not having their cases processed properly in Rwanda and being sent to other countries where there would be risk of inhuman or degrading treatment was such that they allowed the appeal. So they effectively said that the policy was not lawful. The Supreme Court has found overwhelmingly that evidence, particularly evidence given by an expert in this area, UNHCR, which has been on the ground in Rwanda for many, many years. There's a substantial risk that people will not have their asylum claims processed correctly and properly, and that they could be returned to other countries where they would be at risk. So that's where we've come to in this judgment today.
So in very simple terms, the High Court first said it was legal, the Court of Appeal said it wasn't, and today the Supreme Court said, yes, the Court of Appeal was right, it can't go ahead. The basis that you talked about there, this idea of whether or not asylum seekers are sent back to countries that they should have come from, how they are dealt with when they're in that country, this policy of non-refoulement. Can you just explain a little bit more about what that means? Because for a lot of us, that was the first time we've heard of that phrase.
So non-refoulement is really just a fancy word for non-return to a country where you might face persecution or what's called inhuman and degrading treatment. And that's prevented under the Refugee Convention itself, but also under Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And what it means is that you cannot send somebody back to a country where they would be at risk of themselves then not being dealt with safely and fairly, but being sent to another country, potentially their home country, or another country where they would be at risk.
And so what the court has said is that despite what the UK government is saying, that Rwanda is a safe place to process these claims, they have said, actually, look, there's all this evidence, and it's evidence from past the point that these agreements were made with the UK that Rwanda has been doing this and has been doing it specifically with Israel?
So the evidence in relation to the agreement that Israel had with Rwanda from 2013 to 2018, again, was very, very strong because Rwanda had made commitments to deal with people sent from Israel to be processed under their asylum process in a certain way, and had promised not to return people to other countries where they would be at risk. But what we found, and what UNHCR gave clear evidence of, was that a number of people had been taken across borders illicitly, transported across borders with nobody checking them, and taken through other countries like Uganda, which has its own issues and problems, and that they were being moved to all sorts of countries. So it was clear that the promises that they gave to Israel in a similar sort of memorandum of understanding could not be relied on because they had historically shown that wasn't the case. The other thing that was important was that since the signing of the memorandum of understanding between the UK and Rwanda, there had also continued to be violations of not only, the procedures that the UK would expect to have in place and which Rwanda had promised to put in place, but also these very serious issues about people being returned to countries where they were at risk. The fundamental problem is the Rwandan system for asylum is really not safe, and it doesn't have all the protections you would expect in it. In a proper asylum system, it doesn't have a proper appeal system. There's no judicial independence because of the political issues in Rwanda itself. So there are some very, very serious issues that the Rwanda government would have to deal with politically and, in its political system before it can then even start to look at actually reforming the basic asylum system that needs to be in place for these people to be able to be sent there safely.
So before we leave you, in black and white, those who were waiting to possibly be transferred to Rwanda, that is not going to happen for the foreseeable future, is it? If at all? It's not going to happen. In principle, there is the possibility to offshore decisions and to send people to third countries. And lots of other EU countries are now talking about this. This is a big trend in international refugee law that, countries are now looking at these options and policies to offshore their asylum systems. But, our view is that while it's legally possible to do that, it's not within the spirit of the convention, and that the states need to think about sensible solutions where they can deal with this in a humane way and respecting human dignity and not sort of seeking to race the bottom to satisfy voters on particular sides of the political spectrum about, controlling and stopping immigration. Well, from the legal detail to some reaction from those immersed in research and analysis about UK migration. Madeleine Sumption is director of the Migration Observatory. And let's start with those who are threatened with being transferred to Rwanda. From them, there will be an enormous sigh of relief today that there is no way that they will now go, is there?
I think looking at the Supreme Court judgment, it is very difficult to imagine the Rwanda deal happening in, the even remotely foreseeable future. Effectively, the Supreme Court is saying that Rwanda is not a safe country for people to be sent because there's a substantial risk that they could be sent back to their countries of origin where they'd be in danger. And more broadly, it said that Rwanda just doesn't have a good record of living up to the agreements that it enters into.
The policy has been enormously controversial. In statistical terms, do we know if it has actually proved to be a deterrent at all?
So far, it's difficult to say, but certainly the numbers of people crossing the channel in the aftermath of the announcement of the policy continue to be relatively high. It's possible that there would have been a deterrent effect, obviously, once the policy was in place and people were being sent to Rwanda. These things are really uncertain. A lot of the research that we have on deterrent-type policies suggests that actually in most countries, while they can have some impact at the margins, they're not always tremendously effective. And so it's possible that actually, while this decision is important, even if Rwanda had gone ahead, it wouldn't necessarily have been the game changer that I think a lot of commentators make it out to be.
The government says it will now look for other ways to implement this policy. What if the government was to say, right, not Rwanda, but another third country, a country that perhaps may be seen as safer. Do you think that they could do that? And if they could, how quickly they could get that sort of policy through?
Well, this really depends on whether there are other countries queuing up to put in place that sort of deal. I think, the court process, one of the conclusions was that there wasn't anything in principle illegal about the idea of sending asylum seekers to safe third countries. But the challenge, I think, is finding other countries. One of the challenges that the government faces is that a lot of the countries that have good legal processes and good asylum systems and a good track record of human rights, which is what's needed for it to be designated as a safe country, are already actually hosting substantial numbers of refugees and aren't necessarily keen on taking more from the UK. But obviously we'll have to see what the government comes up with on that front.
Where do you think it leaves the government's immigration policy more generally? Do you think the fact that this idea, which was much lauded, was meant to be very hardline and it was going to show a deterrent, has been stymied in the courts? Do you think that this perhaps will lead the government to perhaps pivot more to doing things like, focusing on the backlog, for example, rather than big headline-grabbing policies?
I actually think perhaps counterintuitively that the biggest impact of the Supreme Court decision is not necessarily about whether planes take off to Rwanda, but whether the government decides to fully implement the legislation, the Illegal Migration Act that it passed earlier this year.
Just remind us, for those who are not quite as across it as you are, what is the Illegal Migration Act and why is it so important, its implementation?
So earlier this year, the government passed the Illegal Migration Act, and under that legislation, people who cross the channel in small boats and claim asylum would no longer be able to get a decision on their asylum claim. So this is a really radical, far-reaching change to the UK's asylum system. And that whole policy relies on the idea that there's somewhere else that they can be sent so that they don't remain in the UK. All the eggs were in one basket, effectively, which was Rwanda, and there were no other places currently, no other safe third countries that the government can send people to, unless the government has something up its sleeve and that they have other countries that they're going to sign agreements with. It's very difficult to imagine them wanting to bring that legislation fully into force if there's nowhere for people to go.
So do you think we will see the Illegal Migration Act being shelved potentially?
Well, the Illegal Migration Act has many different components, and some of them are already in force. But I think it's certainly possible that unless the government's able to find other countries that are willing to take asylum seekers from the UK, the core provision of it, that idea that people won't be able to get a decision on their asylum claim, that's effectively the decision that determines whether they're a refugee or not, that may be delayed potentially for quite a long time.
In just a minute, we'll be back with Beth to work out the next moves for the Sunak government, especially ahead of a general election. OK, back to Beth Rigby to pick over the fallout of all of this, with a backdrop, of course, of that letter from Suella Braverman, who seems to have already proved she'll be a knife in the back rather than a thorn in the side.
You've got a whole issue here for Rishi Sunak around the voters and him saying to the country, I am going to have a competent, professionalised, accountable government, and I am going to focus on deliverables. I am going to stop the small boats. This is my pledge to you. So you have that rhetoric, and then you have the reality of everyone seeing that this flagship policy is failing. And then the other issue around all of it, Jayne, is what it unleashes, and this is sort of where Suella Braverman was going with that jaw-dropping letter that she put out ahead of the ruling. It is the Tory civil war over this. And the strength of feeling within the parliamentary party about the Prime Minister needing to deliver this policy, needing to get flights off the ground. I mean, Lee Anderson, who is the deputy chair of the party of law and order, was literally saying today, just start the flights, even if that broke the law. The highest court in the land has ruled that you can't do it. And he's saying, just start the flights. And now it's bubbling up. Well, not bubbling up. I mean, it's sort of gone over, over the sides of the pan.
Lee Anderson's saying this, and obviously the Prime Minister's going to want to throw some red meat to those on the right of the party over this. But James Cleverly, who I suppose he certainly isn't Lee Anderson, a much more moderate voice, he's in the House of Commons. Now, he's holding true to the plan as well.
We have a plan to deliver the Rwanda deal, and we will do whatever it takes to stop the boats.
Just reflecting on what Rishi Sunak has said, do you think, James Cleverly listened to what the Supreme Court has said? Because he seems to think that he can just tinker around the edges and get this plan back off the ground. But that doesn't seem to be what legal experts have said to us. They've said, the government's going to have to go back to square one.
If we unpack kind of what's going on in what James Cleverly said, what the Prime Minister's next steps are and what the party is feeling or thinking, what this goes down to is a view within government that they can try a treaty change or develop a treaty with Rwanda, put it through the House of Commons, declare in law potentially that Rwanda is a safe country and try and satisfy the courts. There's that option. If that fails, they could then try and push through some, and this is what the Prime Minister was alluding to, well, not alluding to, I mean, he said it pretty explicitly, which is that they could push through domestic legislation, so override some of the court ruling in law and change the law domestically in order to get this policy off the ground. And then the third option is to withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights. And this is something that many Tory MPs feel is necessary, that you get a British Bill of Rights, you withdraw from the European Convention, and then they think that this will make the whole thing go away. But to go back to what you were saying, Jayne, about kind of what the court ruling was saying.
Yes, they said it wasn't just the European Court of Rights, it's a whole load, a whole raft of international legislation it breaches.
That it was all different sorts of international legislation. And you saw that in the Commons with Theresa May. She quite clearly stood up, and if I can find, I tweeted it out, she said to the Home Secretary in the Commons, the Supreme Court ruling was, quote, not contingent on the ECHR and was made regardless of the European Convention on Human Rights. And that's the point, really, that if you look at the legal ruling, there's lots of people arguing in the party, and legal experts would argue this isn't about the ECHR. This is like withdrawing from the ECHR is not going to solve the problem. But, Jayne, this is politics, right? And there's a big wing of the Conservative Party that hate the ECHR anyway. They think that they don't want to be chained to EU courts and legislation. Jayne, I saw Simon Clarke earlier, the former cabinet minister, a close ally of Liz Truss. And I asked him about this ECHR issue, and I said to him, is this the next Tory civil war? And he said to me, well, I hope not, because I hope the PM will respond with the appropriate firmness. Certainly, it's a vital question of leadership that he does. And I said, well, if he doesn't put on the table the ECHR, then it is a civil war, isn't it? Because you guys will go to war over it. And he simply replied, I hope we don't need to, Beth. I mean, I was a bit like, oh, okay. I do think that this is, aside from the policy failure, what that means for Rishi Sunak with the voters when it comes to his pledges, there is now this Tory civil war ignited in Technicolor yesterday with that Suella Braverman letter. And now it's kind of rippling across a group in the party that are furious that this policy hasn't got off the ground, and the Prime Minister doesn't seem to be able to give it to them ahead of an election so they can fight it on the doorstep. Because in the end, what MPs want is to be able to go to the voter and say, yeah, we know you're fed up with the small votes, but look, we are sending hundreds of people to Rwanda. They can't do that.
And just because the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary say they will do it doesn't make it true, does it?
Jayne, in politics, people often say they're going to do things and it often does not come true.
Beth.
That's life.
A bombshell. A bombshell on which to end the podcast. Well, that's the Daily for today. I'm Jayne Secker. Hopefully Niall will be back fit and well tomorrow. I'll see you again soon.